Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 77. And this episode, we wanted to talk about the Castlevania Netflix series because in addition to just being something that both Matt and I very much enjoy, it's actually an interesting look at where an adaptation of a video game narrative, and an old one and one that's ostensibly kind of goofy, into a fairly successful narrative in another medium.
Yeah, we've talked about other, medium shifts for games, and we talked about movies that have covered games, like we did Detective Pikachu, which did a pretty good job as far as we're concerned, but Geoff and I are both in agreement that Castlevania is probably one of the best video game adaptations created. And I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that it's animated and the fact that it's a TV show, because I think you can tell a more nuanced story in a TV show. And what's really interesting about this is I know the basics of Castlevania's narrative. Like, we all know Dracula comes, marries a woman gets killed, Dracula kills everybody. Like, that's the gist. And then the Belmonts stop Dracula. But this goes much deeper than that and filled in gaps that when you look back on the games, those details are there too. Characters, narratives, the generations of the Belmonts. This spells it out in a way and gives it life in a way that you can't really do in a video game the same way. You can tell these kind of narratives in games, but I think this anime does it in a way that I think it's much harder to do in games because of the nuance and the dialogue and the storytelling.
Yes, and it's also one that benefits from a certain amount of hindsight of a series. If you were to adapt... So, before we go much further into this is going to be an episode that has spoilers about all current episodes. As of this episode being recorded, Season 3 is out on Netflix and has been for a little bit of time. Long enough for us to both, binge it. So, with that in mind, if you wanted to tell the story of Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse for the NES, which is the anchor point for this series, and only use that game, you would, even with artistic liberties taken, there's a lot of things lost.
Yeah.
It's, as somebody who knows not everything about the Castlevania timeline, but knows more than the average. Yeah, it's easy to take as read now that, yes, Dracula marries a woman. She they have a son. She's burned at the stake, and he swears revenge. That wasn't introduced into the series until Symphony of the Night.
Yep.
The idea that Dracula had a son calling himself Alucard is in Castlevania 3, but you have his designs in the Netflix series based on his Symphony of the Night version. If you look up what his sprite in Castlevania 3, that is not a long-haired Bishonen pretty man.
No, it's definitely not.
Who is fast and agile and powerful. I think he moves slower than Trevor Belmont in the game, if I remember correctly. He's a little clumsy. But you're able to take a game that has many, many releases and spans centuries in its timeline, and you can put all sorts of little bits and pieces in as reference throughout. The Castlevania series has a very wide mythological net for a bestiary. So you're able to draw from not just vague areas of the world culture, not just it's Eastern, it's European. No, that's an Italian demon. That is an Edo period Japanese legend. That is, and there's a wonderful video from Polygon Unraveled, Brian David Gilbert's series, where he talks about the Castlevania enemies, not in great detail. He talks about doing it in detail, and what a boring 4-hour video that is. But which just goes to show, again, how wide that is. So as a Castlevania fan, it is wonderful to watch the show and have moments where rather than it being generic night creatures or strange, Lovecraftian designs, you go, oh my God, that is this enemy. Oh my God, that is, the flame demon. That's Malachi. That's all these ones, and they don't need to make a big deal out of it. They don't need to call it out. It just fits the fabric of the show. And from the get-go, there's artistic liberties. The show doesn't begin with Trevor walking up to the castle going, all right, Dracula, I'm going to fuck you up. So they're already diverging. And it helps also because of who they have writing it, Warren Ellis.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Warren Ellis's writing. And honestly, it was the thing that once I knew that he was the writer for this series before the first season came out, I went, you know what? This might actually work, because he is both hopeful and cynical about the nature of humanity. And Castlevania is the series as a video game and as a Netflix series, as an anime, is also extremely simultaneously, paradoxically cynical and optimistic about humanity.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about how this show is written is it's presented in a way that even if you're not super familiar with Castlevania, but you're interested in gods and monsters, essentially, you can be interested in this show. And what was really interesting to me about the structure and the writing of it is there are sections of characters and moments that I don't even know are in Castlevania lore at all, and I look it up after the fact, and I'm surprised when it is, and not really disappointed when it isn't. You're talking about the demons and how they're created. They're created in this show by Forge Masters, Hector
Yes.
and Isaac to be specific. And I don't recall anything about the two, like the characters. I believe are somewhere in those in the Castlevania Legacy, but I don't know
They're
the
in
Forge
Curse
Master
of
thing.
Darkness.
Right.
Yeah, the Forge Master and both Hector and Isaac.
Yeah. And so, like, it's interesting how they use those characters from other games and wrap them into the story in a way that might not have played in the games but works here. Also, like, most people are familiar with the first Castlevania and Simon Belmont, and that name tends to be the most familiar. So to start with Trevor and to start with more or less the Symphony of the Night story, or a cross between Symphony of the Night and Dracula 3, Castlevania 3 rather, is interesting because they could have gone all the way back. And what's really interesting about starting where they started is they can always go back either in flashbacks or an alternate timeline or whatever. I think the way they've built this series, they can kind of take it in any direction, which is also really interesting as far as a construction for a show based on a game that's existed for as long as it has.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether or not this would become a anthology style thing of, oh, here's the story of Trevor, and then we get the story of Simon or of Richter or of Leon, whom one of the fun things with the Castlevania series is it's had a Legend of Zelda-like quality of, and this is the original story, until 10 years later. No. We go back a century. This is the original story. 3 years later. No. 4 generations before that. Here's where it all started. And so, I mean, originally Simon, the original protagonist of Castlevania, the original, also of 4, also of Chronicles. He's in Smash. It's Simon Belmont. Then Castlevania 3 was but the Belmonts have been doing this for a long time, and the first time was when his ancestor Trevor did it. But in the Netflix series, they acknowledge Leon Belmont from Lament of Innocence, whom the fact that the thing with the Castlevania series as well is there's several entries that you can look at and go, do we have to adapt that one? Do we have to bring in Reinhard Schneider? I mean, we could, but do we have to? So acknowledging Leon is acknowledging another aspect of canon, like taking the fog of war off of it and going, yes, we're working with that. So are they also going to use that origin of Dracula? I don't know. Are we going to get a little bit of Leon in a later season? I'd be interested in seeing that myself, but I'm a huge Castlevania mark, so that's a thing. And it does make sense for Trevor's story to be the anchor point for the Castlevania series, because even in the NES version, it was in the lore that the Belmonts before that were feared by the people for their supernatural power, and it was a bringing in of allies. You've already got a built-in supporting cast, and Symphony of the Night is the jumping off point for so many Castlevania fans.
Well, and it's regarded as one of the best Castlevanias ever made, fairly unanimously, with some exception. But like for the most part, like when people say what's their favorite Castlevania game, it's often, or where they think the series got its strongest hold was Symphony of the Night. You know, the Castlevania games for Nintendo and Super Nintendo were good and people liked them, but it wasn't until Symphony of the Night where there was a more elaborate story, voice acting for better or worse, like it did things that it hadn't done yet, you know, and kind of propelled the series to its famed status that it achieved.
Right. So yeah, you're right. Even if someone doesn't say it's their favorite Castlevania, they're going to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
So it perfectly makes sense. It nicely ties those two, you know, looking at Symphony and Dracula's Curse nicely ties together the two different kinds of Castlevanias as people see it. There's some other variations, but your Classicvania and your Metroidvania.
Yeah.
As well as narratively makes sense. There's a certain amount of all of the other Belmonts, all of the other known Castlevania protagonists. There would almost need to be both more and less explanation, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like Trevor Belmont's story, his iteration of Dracula is the most sensical in terms of if you did Leon Belmont, you would have a lot of, all right, it feels like we have to tell the story of Lament of Innocence, which is a lot of weird wink, nods, and burying the lead as far as so when does Dracula show up? Any other Belmont, and you almost have to go, well, as everybody knows, Dracula comes back every now and again, and it's up to the Belmonts to fight him. Trevor Belmont is a nice coming together of, oh, there's this horrible monster raising his way across the world for vengeance for his wife, which is why Alucard was fighting him, and even in the games, as it were. And Trevor is that nice, like, oh, well, the Belmonts should come back and help us out. Yeah, it's the... In hindsight, and looking at it as a fan, not being in on the writers' meeting on this, being like, well, yeah, this all makes perfect sense.
Sure. And what's really interesting about the way the seasons are broken up is that they split the perspectives. You know, for most of the first season, it's just Trevor's perspective and Dracula's perspective, right? Or around those two. But then, spoiler alert, after in the second season when they defeat Dracula, in the third season, the perspective shifts between Trevor and Sypha, who are together, and Alucard, which is interesting because it's still the perspective of someone who lives in Dracula's castle, because that's where Alucard is residing now. And we get a little bit of a third perspective because Saint Germain becomes a fairly important character for the third season. A character who is fairly obscure in the lore, but still does exist and has been around in the games. And I think the way they worked him in this is pretty interesting. Also, talking about Saint Germain brings me to the voice actors and the insane amount of voice acting talent that's in this show. But then getting people like Bill Nighy to play Saint Germain or Jason Isaacs to play the judge this season, like huge acting names to play these characters, you know, that I don't even realize it's their voice until much later on because they're doing such a good job.
And there's more than a few actors that are part of the cast that you're not used to them as voice actors.
Yeah.
You know, having Richard Armitage, having, you know, Graham McTavish come in and do that, it definitely elevates it in its way because they all do a fantastic job. Like, I don't think they're going to bring in a name actor or, you know, a great actor and have them turn in crap.
For sure.
So great casting, great directing on everyone's part there. So I can't think of any weak links there.
No, and I think what's really interesting, going back to Warren Ellis and the writing, like what I love about the first season of this show is that they let you spend enough time with Dracula and his wife to actually feel bad for Dracula. Not all the time, but like there's some empathy created because in this case, and as usual in most storytelling, the humans are assholes, especially the church are assholes, which is what it is. And I think that being able to bring you in that way with the writing, and then as soon as Dracula starts to act up, you go, oh wait, that's right. Like, Dracula would kill me. I'm not supposed to side with him. And even showing Trevor as like the reluctant hero in season 1, but doing it really well. These characters are relatable, and they're not. And the show is not afraid to be horrifically violent, but also incredibly funny. Like, they don't mind getting goofy. They know that this is a fantasy story, and so like being silly at times elevates the writing, because if you take yourself that seriously, you'll burn out on something like this.
It's true. And I know that there have been complaints and there is criticisms of the show where the seasons feel as though there's not enough action throughout, or there's a lot of just moving pieces into place kind of feeling. But one, this is a show designed to be released in season chunks, so you watch it all as one thing, which, you know, say if that works for you or doesn't. That's a personal preference. Also, the original vision for this Castlevania adaptation, if I'm not mistaken, the first season, which is only 4 episodes, was intended to be an 80-minute movie.
Yep.
And the second season was an extension of that. It was written as 3 movies, like that would be released one at a time. So the first season is its own movie. The second season is the other 2, sort of capping off the trilogy with, well, the death of Dracula. And from there, I think it continues that motif, or that, not motif, but that like mode. And while, yeah, season 3 definitely has a lot of feelings of, well, this piece moved over here, this piece moved over here, this piece moved over here. When around episode 8, I believe, maybe the end of 7, when like the first domino fell and you just get to watch mayhem, was so rewarding, so worth it. I don't know if I'd want a Castlevania series that is, you know, 70s heavy metal or like high levels of ultra violence constantly. I'm here for the gothic drama and the meditations and thoughts on humanity and the divine and the abyssal and what it means to betray and to love and to what is destiny. I'm here for that shit. Give it to me, and we get it. And with all the different perspectives and pieces, and getting both sympathetic and unsympathetic views of our heroes and our protagonists, you can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, and what season 3 does masterfully that the other seasons did okay, and I think it's because season 3 is the first season where it's been accepted that these aren't movies anymore. This is a series. We're going to write it as a series. Is that the third season starts off with Trevor and Sypha enjoying being monster hunters, having fun with it, you know, playing it up, overacting, being goofy.
Yeah. And
then by the end of the season, the bookend when they're leaving this town that they get to in the first episode, they hate it all. They hate this life. They, you know, it reminds them why it's not fun, why it's not a game. And I think that's really important to show. And in a similar way, you know, we see Alucard in this season living alone, talking to himself, going a little crazy, wanting companionship. He gets it, and then he's betrayed by people who just have inexperience. It's not even like they necessarily hate him. They just have been wronged and have an experience. And it reminds Alucard why he was alone. And it's really sad. And also the last 1 or 2 episodes, the hard jump between heavy sexual moments and heavy violent moments, showing this high range of emotion on either end in many different ways, is really interesting and a way to tell a story that I never thought that I would jive with, but that I felt worked really well and was very visceral.
Yeah, it was a grand display and dance of vulnerability and the potential consequences therein. and it's very interesting in the sense where they had the interposition of Alucard and Hector, in the sense of one was attacked. Well, I mean, both were attacked in their way, but who had the power? Both of them were bound and betrayed, but in what way and in what vulnerable sense and in what? It was a very interesting push and pull there. And at the end of the season, you have many sympathetic characters at an emotional low. And I'm curious in what direction they're going to take season 4. I certainly don't feel like they have nowhere to go. They have all kinds of places to go to. And they've already given us a lot of more nuanced portrayals and interpretations of these characters. I mean, if you play through Castlevania Curse of Darkness, this Isaac is so much better than the one in the game.
For sure.
And I am left at all times wondering, like, where's he going with this? What's he doing? What is his story? Where is his vengeance? Where is his folly? Where is his fall? Where is his rise? And he's thus far been a fantastic philosophical character, watching his mortal musings while also being kind of a monster while still seeking humanity. He's carrying on the role of Dracula as he exists in this series, in a way where Dracula is actively a monster. Like his existence, he is passively and actively a monster while seeking to understand humanity.
Well, yeah, and I misspoke a little bit earlier in saying that the main perspectives are just Trevor and Sypha and Alucard, because we do spend a ton of time with Isaac and then with Carmilla and her brood as well, having 4 perspectives that it jumps between for the most part. And the focus they give Isaac in this season is really great because you really get to know him as a character, whereas in the previous seasons, like, you do spend some time with him, but him and Hector both didn't get much spotlight because at the end of the day, the focus was always reshifted to Dracula or Carmilla or the other vampires. And the whole plot line of Isaac discovering these places and wanting to just pass through peacefully with his horde of demons, which seems ridiculous to say, but ultimately he doesn't want to harm these humans. He wants to move on. His target is seemingly Carmilla, and he doesn't want to fight. But every time the humans stop him and are like, you're different, you're a monster, these are monsters, you must die, plays to a lot of the darkest sides of the human race, and that we hate and fear what we don't understand. And it happens time after time. But then for Isaac to meet the ship captain, and the ship captain, who is played by, where's the actor? By Lance Reddick, who is incredible in the John Wick movies, just to name a few things. This character, the captain, has seen everything and doesn't want any trouble, just wants strange companionship and to travel. And that dichotomy, and then for Isaac's story to resolve with him trying to liberate this city who's being controlled by a mad sorcerer, is a very human thing to do, even though he's technically just passing through. His arc is really fascinating, and I'm really curious to see how it resolves and how it clashes with Carmilla's brood, which is only just getting started, right? They want to take over that territory. They're trying to get Hector to make monsters for them. The conflict isn't clear, right? Like, we definitely have no idea where Trevor and Sypha or Alucard will end up because their minor story resolves. But then we have these 2 other major stories that progressed, but still have so many different places to go in the next season.
Yeah, you have throughout season 3, Alucard he started out aimless, directionless, and then got a little bit of something, and then was betrayed, and was thus is back to being aimless, but more darkly. And Trevor and Sypha also are doing something and are wandering and seeing new things and new people, but there is a sort of aimlessness to what they're doing and who they are. Whereas Carmilla and her brood with Hector and Isaac are very focused, and you're not sure exactly how and where. And it's a wonderful extension of, because within the Castlevania games, there's almost this insinuation certainly I've picked it up, that it's like, well, Dracula's the big fight, and then after that, the Belmonts just kind of keep the Belmonts going for the next time Dracula shows up. But there's, in spin-off games or in further deviations from the Belmont norm, I guess, you do see that there are still, cults worshiping evil. There are still portals to the demonic. So, of course, once Dracula is dead, the fight isn't over. And Dracula isn't the only vampire. Even within game canon, he's not the only vampire. So, yeah, this stuff continues and this stuff goes on. And Isaac's horde, his army, and his crusade is an interesting look at, I agree with humanity and what we accept and don't accept. But also, it is a statement on humanity's tendency to assert its power and dominance over whatever it can, whether natural or constructed. You could argue that letting Isaac pass through because he's not here for us, well, what happens the day that he is and he has a stronger army? It doesn't justify it, but these are the questions. I mean, even in the conversation that Isaac has with the ship captain, there is no conclusion drawn. There are simply questions asked because they don't necessarily have an answer. And if they do, it changes from person to person, and it may change from day to day. Everybody is set on a path at the end of season 3. There's a definite feeling of, okay, they know they're getting another season. Like, hell yeah. Do we start season 4 action-packed? Probably not. If we do, it's fine because a lot of pieces are in place. Maybe the Vampire Sisters campaign begins in earnest. I don't know.
Yeah, I appreciate a show where I never know where it's going. And even with season 2, like, I thought they might kill Dracula, but I wasn't sure, right? Because it's Castlevania. Dracula is one of the major villains in Castlevania. So it was hard to think that that's where they were going to go. But when they did and they went there, it was kind of glorious and unexpected, right? Because Dracula at that point almost feels defeated based on everything that's happened. And so the fight almost feels like overkill at that point. But it's not, because he's still all-powerful, even if his heart's not in it, or what he considers his heart. I also really love that this show will take its time when it needs to. Again, most of the action was on the back half of season 3, but it was satisfying because they took their time to get there. And they did pepper in some action in the middle and in the beginning, but not a ton, because it made the release so much more satisfying. Like the comparison to sex, almost this build up, this yearning for that moment, that peak, and then we hit it, and it's just insane what goes on in those last minutes. And also to weave in smaller stories like of the judge, and to show that he was off the whole season, and then why, because he was actually a creep and a disgusting human, but you couldn't really understand why. You knew it was there based on his demeanor, but you couldn't quite understand it. Or even the stuff with Saint Germain and him being so present, and him having his own story that just kind of interweaved with Trevor and Sypha, shows that those characters to Castlevania exist and have existed in the games. Smaller, minor characters who have an importance in moments, even if they're not important through the whole narrative. And I think this series has done that really well. Even with the other vampires, the vampire generals in the first and second season, also are done in a way that make you appreciate those smaller characters, even if they're not in every scene.
Yeah, I mean, they have their stories, they have their wants and needs and goals, and they also flesh out the world further. I really expected Saint Germain to be a more heinous character than he was. Just because if there's one complaint I have, it's that if you meet a character, you give them a name, they're going to do something horrible eventually.
Yeah.
They're going to have a dark secret and be awful. Oh, God. Like, I was waiting for the... Oh, God, I was waiting for the shoe to drop on the judge. Oh, God, that's horrible.
Yeah, pretty much.
But then it did. And I mean, and Saint Germain may yet prove to be horrible. And he's now in the Infinite Corridor. He's now in hell. He's now doing all that. Who knows how he's going to come back?
Yeah.
If he comes back, when he comes back.
Sure. And like, I also love that with those minor characters that some of them get to do so much and then like have non-glorious deaths. Like the fact that they had Peter Stormare in this show and that he played Godbrand, and did it so well in the first 2 seasons, and like then his death is almost anticlimactic along with a lot of the other vampire generals, is just, I think, also a brilliant way of writing, because you want to leave some people unsatisfied with the results of certain things, because that's life, right? And that these horrible characters get their due, and sometimes it's not a glorious battle. Sometimes it's just this disgusting, horrible, quick end.
Yeah, like Sumi and Taka got taken out.
Yeah. And this idea that there was a genuine fear for a moment with them that, oh my God, are they going to kill Alucard? Because that would be a bold direction, especially since Alucard is such an integral part of the series now.
Yeah.
And the fact that their deaths just happen, because while Alucard is struggling, we don't know that he's summoning something with ease to take them out and to call his magic sword, which he hid from them, which makes that moment even more shocking for the characters and for the audience, because it's easy to forget when we've been so far from that battle with his sword.
Yeah, that is what it is. And as he said, he never lied to them. And it is also, that is his Isaac walking through town moment.
Yeah.
He has only tried to show kindness in his way as best he can, to learn to trust and befriend and love. And he can only be as kind as he can be, and then be met with, well, we need to kill vampires. We need to become stronger. You lied to us because everybody lies to us. You are using us because everybody uses us. He can't force them to trust him. He can't force them to see what he's trying to do. So in the end, nature wins out, I guess.
I guess so, yeah. I think that what I really, at the end of the day, love about this show is the complete package, which is, I think seems obvious to say, but the fact that not only is the animation phenomenal, that the writing is phenomenal, and that the voice acting is phenomenal, but also the music is incredible, the pacing. It's rare that shows, especially shows based on another property, get all of that stuff correct. Like, it is clear and apparent that Warren Ellis is a fan of Castlevania. He's not just creating this.
I don't think he's ever played the games, actually.
Really?
Really.
Interesting.
I think it's one where, because I think he is, if not the only writer, the head writer, I'm pretty sure he's the only writer of the show.
Right.
I think it's a matter of he's been given enough background on things and enough information to craft the story he wants to make, and then the designs and those choices go to production, and those are where a lot of the like more fan-based fandom, fan servicey elements occur. And I think that's one of the better strengths of the show. It's not trying to cleave as much as we were just talking about, and I was just talking about, Castlevania 3 is a great jumping in point. They probably went, well, we figure that's what it should be. So, Mr. Ellis, could you? Yeah, sure. And not being beholden to the canon super hard like that allows for it to be more about the story and less about, well, we need to fit death in there somewhere. Well, we need to make this boss a thing.
Yeah.
So it's a nice push and pull of, you can have the best fan service. It's something that I've certainly found in the last 10, 15 years, and I imagine others have found it more eloquently and elegantly, that the best fan servicey elements are ones that are not called out. They just are, and they happen. And if you are adapting something with many entries, or with a rich and varied world, or so many conflicting viewpoints because of so many different entries from so many different creators, by weaving in those elements, you acknowledge them without having to stop and go, this thing, of course.
Yeah.
Which slows down and feels hokey.
Well, yeah, and I think they do the perfect example of that in season 3 is when Saint Germain is talking to the judge, and Saint Germain mentions toilet paper, and it being from the East, shows that he's either well-traveled or the time traveler that he's referencing from the games. But either way, they don't call it out. You can just take that moment, because the judge goes, "What the hell is toilet paper?" you can take that as the audience is going, aha, he is a time traveler, or just, aha, he is weird. And I find that really fun.
Yeah.
I think also like the big beast, like the final demon that they fight at the end as they're trying to bring back Dracula and do so unsuccessfully, he is not depicting a particular boss from the games, but his movement is reminiscent of a boss from one of the games, even though it's not a specific boss creature.
Yes. You get those sorts of things. You get the they don't use nothing but Castlevania music for the show.
Yeah.
Which, look, I am a huge fan of Castlevania music. It is up there as far as series with a consistently amazing superlative soundtrack.
Yeah.
But in that same way that you were talking about before, Matt, that like tension, release, anticipation, and satisfaction. When at the end of season 2, when Trevor, Sypha, and Alucard are storming the castle and Bloody Tears starts playing,
yeah,
I might have actually cried.
Yeah.
Like, they didn't have to do that. They did do it. If it was nothing but the Castlevania music itself is music for, assaulting the castle. It is for the big fights. The acknowledgement that, if you spend hours and hours throwing yourself at a Castlevania game, if you spend 8 hours, 10 hours fully exploring the castle as Alucard and getting all of the special items and familiars and unlocking every nook and cranny, you can't take hours to attack a castle and take down a vampire. That probably is only half an hour. So, yeah, you have those big fights, and that's when you use the Castlevania music, like cool arrangements of it, like for those big epic things, and it is a furthering of that. It's another sense being satisfied, like when is the Castlevania-ness going to be the big monster fight? Oh, and they're using the music. Yes.
Yeah, I think this series has no shortage of epic moments that are backed by things of the games, whether it's characters or music or sound cues or even just displays. The way the fire is animated, the way the ice is animated, and even the electricity in season 3 that she uses for the first time, the whip and how that combat, like all of the combat is animated in a way that it's not exactly like the games, because of course it wouldn't be, but it's reminiscent of.
Right.
Even Alucard's fighting style towards the end of season 2 is very floaty in the same way his movement is in Symphony of the Night. And whether that's on purpose or not, it's still, there's enough ambiguity that you can connect things the way you want to as a fan, but you don't feel left out as someone who has never seen anything about Castlevania. Like, honestly, I would recommend this anime to anybody who likes vampire stories, because you don't need to know about Castlevania to enjoy this story.
I've definitely recommended this to friends where it's, yeah, I know you don't play a ton of video games, or I know you don't know Castlevania. A friend of ours who is a huge comic book fan and a big Warren Ellis fan, I'm like, dude, you don't need to know the games. Like, there is so much of a authority, humanity, or bastards element in this. Like, watch the first season. Even if you watch nothing else, you'll love that season. And you can continue watching if you'd like. There's vampires, there's betrayal, there's high emotions and just wildness. It is easy to recommend for people who like these sorts of stories, not just fans of the game, but also if you're a fan of the game, you're a fan of these kinds of stories. Not 100%, but there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that these stories, for a game that does focus around a lot of violence, because that's, it's a kill all the monsters kind of game, that they find a way to not make it all about the violence. And that the violence is fairly graphic, I think, in a way that's realistic to a degree, is important, right? We don't want to glorify this violence. And there's nothing wrong with glorifying the killing of monsters to a degree. That's what a lot of games and sci-fi and fantasy are about.
Right.
In a way we've talked about, like with Doom, like the point is that these demons are dying in a gory fashion. That's kind of part of the action. But here, because there is a lot of human death, there is a lot of innocent death, that they don't glorify that. They make it chunky and gross and clumsy. Even when skilled fighters are fighting, the deaths and the combat isn't perfect. There is a clunkiness to some of it because they're trying to base it in some semblance of reality, even though it is fantasy.
Yeah, you have at the beginning of season 3 a showcasing of Sypha and Trevor having essentially a random encounter with night creatures. Yes. And within it, you see the methods to why would Trevor try to fight at all hand to hand with Dracula? Why? But you then see him use methods and techniques and hammering the same point over and over and wearing down the defenses of things with even supernatural strength and being able to tear through those defenses. And you get that visceral payoff. And yeah, if the show was nothing but a blood tour, it would definitely have its fans. But I don't think we would get 22 episodes and counting of it necessarily. You could get a 6-episode bloodbath, but I think we're getting a more sustainable, a story with legs to it.
Yeah. I have a few questions for you, Geoff, and we can both answer them. My first question is, just in the anime, not in the games,
okay,
do you have a favorite character so far?
Ooh. That is interesting. I mean, I like a lot of different characters for a lot of different reasons.
Sure.
I think Sypha might be my favorite character.
Yeah.
She has a lot of interesting mini arcs. She has a wonderful smartest person in the room but doesn't always know everything aspect.
Yeah.
A certain amount of I've made a terrible mistake. Which, maybe that's Trevor rubbing off on her. I don't know. But even before that, there's a certain amount of there's almost this cheery realism to her.
Yeah.
I don't think she's a pessimist. I don't think she's a cynic. But I also don't see her as blindly just being oh, isn't this all wonderful?
She definitely has moments of that, though.
She does. But I think she is somebody who... She grew up a speaker. She grew up as part of a group that's we ask questions and are punished for it. We have to wander. We have to maintain a certain amount of anonymity as best we can, because what we do is glorious work, and what we do is for the betterment of people, even if the people don't want it. So you come up through that. There's almost a sense of you have to be optimistic about what you do and feel like you're doing good. But also, see, God hates me kind of thing.
Yeah.
And look, I think it's super cool watching wizard fights.
Yeah.
I'm just going to leave that there.
That's fair.
What about you, Matt?
I think for me, predictably, as a kid who grew up in the 90s, who had long hair, listened to a lot of heavy metal, and could have been considered goth, that it would be very hard for Alucard to not be my favorite character.
Nice.
Also, I have a soft spot for pretty men. Which is no secret to you or any of the listeners. But I think especially, I don't know that I loved Alucard in the games. I think Simon was one of my favorite characters, in the games, just because I liked the classics. Mm-hmm. I liked Alucard as a character, but I didn't, I wasn't quite obsessed with his character in the games by any means. But here, we get so much of Alucard's personality. We get to see multiple sides of him. But he's also drawn and made in a way that is just way more engaging than I think any of the other mediums that depicted him before. And that said, his style, the way he talks, the way he carries himself, his fighting style, but also his learning, he longs for his father. He doesn't, even though he feels betrayed by his father and hates his father, in those final scenes in the second season, he also loves his father, problems and all, and that even though killing him is what he wanted, there's clearly an emptiness. And they explore that in the third season, where he's talking to himself and talking to dolls that he created of Trevor and Sypha and whoever else. It's really interesting the way to depict him, but I feel a kinship to this character on the more depressing side, just because he feels vulnerable and alone in a way that I can relate to from moments of my own life. And I think he's written in a brilliant way that you can't help but relate.
That's fair. And I think all of my deep dives into the games have, like, I love the Alucard of the games in all of his incarnations.
Yes.
In Castlevania 3, in Symphony of the Night, in Aria and Dawn of Sorrow. So I think also him showing up in the series for me is just more of a, yeah, there's my boy. And Sypha surprised me so much, which is why she's become a favorite. But yeah, like, no arguments here as far as Alucard. Pretty wonderful, confident tragedy. Love him.
My other question was, do you have a favorite scene or moment from the show?
That's interesting.
Yeah, and which I know it's hard to pinpoint. There's so many things that are standoutish.
Recent memory, Isaac's conversation with the ship captain, like their debate. Like, Isaac is also a, like, close second, close third. Like, he's up there as far as favorite character goes, just because I don't want him to win, but I find him endlessly fascinating. He's one where it's a character of, I don't agree with your views. You are a villain and you are doing monstrous things, but continue exploring. I want to see in this fictional plane how this pans out. And so I think many of Isaac's conversations with wandering folks, with the mad woman before he takes the town, with the ship captain, like, those are some of my favorite scenes.
Those are good. Yeah, I would say even the antique salesman in the very early part of the season 2, when he gets the mirror,
yes,
is another one of those conversations. He has quite a few of them. That's a good choice. I think those are really great. It's hard. Like, the third season, of course, stands out much more than the first two, just because I've watched it most recently. But I think my favorite moment is the moment you mentioned in season 2 when they siege the castle, right? And familiar music is playing, and it's a familiar moment. I think that was just kind of a culmination of all I wanted from Castlevania as a show and what I never knew I needed for Castlevania as a show. But I think in the third season specifically, my favorite moment is when Alucard is betrayed and then takes revenge, just because I didn't see it coming. Like, there were a lot of other things that I predicted, like that the goal of the monks was they were trying to bring back Dracula, or that Isaac,
of course,
was going to try and liberate this town, if for nothing else, for the satisfaction. Like, that stuff, none of that was surprising. Or Saint Germain wanting to go into the Infinite Corridor. Like, all that stuff was fairly well predicted and choreographed. But the betrayal of Alucard I didn't see coming. And so that whole scene, once they've betrayed him and then him killing them, was so shocking to me, especially since I liked Sumi and Taka so much. I thought they were such good characters that I was just, like, blown away when they turned like that, even though they hinted at it very slightly. That scene stands out, and how quickly Alucard, after struggling, because he clearly didn't want to end them that way, so he struggled to see if he could just get loose himself.
Yeah.
Once he realized that he couldn't, how quickly he dispatched them because he had no choice was just so jarring, that I think is one of my favorite moments in the series, because I just had no idea it was coming.
Yeah, it's we all process trauma differently and do not mistake kindness and mercy for weakness.
Right. I think that this show has a lot of places to go. I'm very excited for further installments, and I kind of just hope it goes on forever. I know it won't, but there's so much history with Castlevania that I feel like they could run this for, 6 or 7 or 8 seasons and not feel like it's running out of material.
Agreed. And again, if at any point they're like, well, now let's tell the story of Richter, or now let's do some flashback stuff, there's possibilities and potential. And certainly I think where season 4 goes is going to be very telling for the future of the show. Like, season 3 was definitely the first, like, okay, Dracula's dead. Now what monsters? So there we go.
Yeah.
And speaking of Dracula, I do before we finish things up, just as a goofy thing, I want to point out the fact that they just leaned into Dracula being 8 feet tall.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the idea that rather than try to make the final boss fight of a Castlevania game where Dracula is always twice the size of a Belmont into some like, oh, this is a display of power, oh, this is whatever. It's like, nah.
He's just big.
Dracula just big. Dracula big man. Fight big Dracula man.
I will say,
I love it.
I will say that I am a little sad that they never worked in the "What is a man" speech, but a horrible pile of lies.
You know what?
But I'm okay.
I'm kind of happy they didn't.
Sure. I think it would have been funny for like if Dracula was going to address people, that someone like maybe Hector tried to write him a speech and he like reads that line and it's like, what is this garbage or something? Like, I think that would be fun. But
I think it'd be fun if in season 4, Alucard says something like it as just like, this is his broody edge personality.
Ooh, that's a good idea. I like that. Warren, if you're listening, you can use that.
Yeah, where he left off at the end of season 3 is a little dark. And maybe he comes out of it by the time he reconvenes with people. But for just a moment there, he's just sitting there. What is a man? Or whatever.
Of course, listeners, we want to know what your favorite moments of this show has been, or favorite characters, or why you like it or why you don't like it. We're always humbled by being called out or being told we're wrong about things, but I think it's pretty easy to agree that this is a pretty well-made show. But we always like to hear your thoughts. If you haven't watched it, let us know if this encourages you to watch it. We'd love to know your thoughts on the show and what you think of it.
Yeah, this is... I think the success of the Castlevania Netflix series is a wonderful thing for the series itself and for potential adaptations of other properties in the future. And we'd love to hear which characters you want to see, what things you missed, what things you hope for in the future. What are your predictions for season 4? We want to know. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.